Thanks everyone for joining us at the Project Censored radio show. I'm your co-host, Eleanor Goldfield, and we're very glad to welcome back onto the program Dr. Margaret Flowers, who is the director of popularresistance.org and the host of Clearing the Fog, and she is also a co-founder of the Sanctions Kill campaign. Margaret, thanks so much for coming back on the show.
Oh, thank you for inviting me, Eleanor.
Absolutely. So I wanted to ask you on here to talk about the recent study that came out of the Lancet medical journal, which is perhaps the most well-respected peer-reviewed academic journal in the world. And they came out with a study for the August 2025 issue titled Effects of International Sanctions on Age-Specific Mortality, a Cross-National Panel Data Analysis. And just to share a quick quote from the study, quote, "Our findings showed a significant causal association between sanctions and increased mortality. We found the strongest effects for unilateral, economic, and U.S. sanctions, whereas we found no statistical evidence of an effect for UN sanctions. We estimated that unilateral sanctions were associated with an annual toll of 564,258 deaths, similar to the global mortality burden associated with armed conflict," end quote. I mean, this is both a staggering finding and perhaps for people like you who've been doing this for such a long time, it's kind of in the duh category. So could you start us off here talking about the difference between what they mention here, unilateral sanctions and UN sanctions, and how the US can leverage such power on its own to cause so much death and destruction?
Yeah, this is a really important distinction, and this is a very important study. Even though we have a number of studies showing a link between sanctions and deaths, this is the one that actually looked at sanctions causing the deaths. So what the United States imposes on other countries, technically we wouldn't even call sanctions. Sanctions is a form of punishment. You have a legal system like the International Court of Justice, the UN court, that has a complaint from a country that's doing something, maybe committing genocide like Israel does. And they decide we need to do something. We found this country guilty of this crime. We need to punish them. We're going to impose sanctions upon them as a punishment. That's kind of the original purpose of sanctions. What the United States has done is taken that and weaponized it and used it, imposing these unilateral, they're called unilateral coercive economic measures, or we just call them UCMs, unilateral coercive measures, that the United States unilaterally imposes on another country, often making up reasons for it. Like the US will just say, oh, we think Venezuela's, supporting terrorism or a threat to our national security, so we have to punish them. There's no judicial process. Often there's no congressional input, although Congress has been responsible for this. And the US just decides, okay, we want to cause chaos in this country. We want to destabilize it or punish it for not being more US friendly. And so we're going to impose this economic blockade on it, really. And what this effectively does is it targets the civilian population. It means that that country can't import the food that it needs, can't import the medicines or the medical supplies it needs, can't even import the parts to maintain their infrastructure, like their water systems or their, power energy systems or things like that. And so it ends up being a huge burden on the civilian population.
Yeah, and I wanted to dig into that a little bit deeper because then how for instance, if the UN were to sanction Israel, how would that look different? Like, how would that affect, for instance, the ability to get medicine or the ability to get food? What is the difference in those economic blockade functions?
Right. Right. So the United Nations specifically focuses on sanctions that do not cause harm to the civilian population. So they may sanction individuals or, they aren't preventing that country from trading with other countries. They may, say that individuals can't travel, or they may sanction the individuals that are responsible for, certain crimes, like Benjamin Netanyahu in particular, so that he wouldn't be able to travel out of the country and, come to the U.S. and conspire. to do evil things. So they specifically make sure that those countries can still get the aid that they need, the medicine that they need, and those kinds of things. They're really looking at individuals who are responsible.
And in terms of this study, I'm curious, like, what is your reaction to the reaction? I mean, have you seen any kind of reactions from whether that be media or whether that be people who work on these issues? Has there been any kind of response? Like, I'm thinking not just because of the number, but also because of how the U.S. does foreign policy. Madeleine Albright being asked if it was worth the death of 500,000 Iraqi children, and she said, yeah. Um, I'm curious, what have you seen in terms of any kind of response to this, or is this just kind of once again proving to the United States that it's a dealer in death and the U.S. response is meh?
Yeah, I mean, this should be a study that people should be aware of widely. I mean, basically what this is saying is that the US's economic coercive measures, which are imposed on more than 40 countries in the world, primarily global South countries, are killing over 550,000 people every year for the past 10 years. That's 47,000 people a month. I mean, we hear about the number of deaths in Gaza. It's terrible. It's staggering. The number of deaths in like Sudan or Somalia, but this is a comparable number to what that is. I mean, we're talking about more people, I think, than that were killed in the bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Those were hundreds of thousands of people. But we're not seeing this in the major news. And what's interesting is that in the United States, we don't see a critique of what the US's economic measures are doing. It's usually left out. So, they talk about migrants coming to the United States. They talk about the fact that we've destabilized their countries economically with sanctions. No, we don't hear that conversation happening. And so we're not seeing, that type of response that we should be seeing. And we don't really even see a critique of the sanctions. They're really sold to the population as a humanitarian form of putting pressure on another country. And that's what people in the United States are led to believe, that we're not killing people. We're just, we're just sanctioning them. And this is as deadly. This is what we've been saying now through the Sanctions Kill campaign is sanctions kill. They're not like a bomb that gets dropped on a country. You don't see the bodies lying there. It's silent deaths. It's the child who needs cancer treatment and can't travel out of the country to the cancer center because their country can't pay for that care. And this is real. I mean, in Venezuela, there are families who are stranded outside of the country. They've gone outside of the country to get care for their cancer. They can't get payment. They can't put the payment through for that care. I ran into this when I was in Iran. And the United States has cut ties with Iran, has sanctioned Iran. And one of our members of our group needed to be hospitalized, and we didn't have a way to pay for it because the U.S. has made it so that we can't have economic transactions, with them. It's the elderly who aren't getting the air conditioning or aren't getting the clean water. It's the babies, again, same thing, having diarrheal diseases. It's a kind of a silent death that it causes.
Yeah, absolutely. And it really, to me, it speaks to this removal from the boots on the ground kind of mentality. Like, oh, well, we're not putting boots on the ground, so it's okay. We're not actually sending your sons and daughters to fight, so it's okay. But that doesn't mean, as you pointed out, that people aren't dying. And I wanted to ask you also, because there's in terms of the US's power to do this is, of course, based on the US's economic stance. Like if Sweden all of a sudden said, I'm sanctioning a bunch of countries, like no one would really
Right.
Right. So how does this then speak to the way that the like economies are shifting in terms of BRICS and like basically saying like we're not going to use the dollar? I mean, do you see like I know you don't have a crystal ball, but do you see anything shifting so that the US might not actually have the power to kill more than 500,000 people a year due to its economic stance?
I mean, things are definitely shifting in the world, and the U.S. economic war on so many countries is part of the driving factor of that. I mean, it's not just the sanctions, but the United States also just freezes the assets of other countries. So, when the U.S. left Afghanistan, and 80% of Afghanistan's central bank monies were held outside of the country. The U.S. basically just said, oh, you can't have access to that, really effectively causing incredible poverty and hardship in Afghanistan. We've done the same thing to Venezuela, the same thing to Russia. And so countries are looking at that and they're saying, oh, if they can do that to our neighbors, the United States can do that to us as well. And so more and more countries are starting to create these alternative systems, because another piece of the sanctions is that the U.S. and all of this, all of what the United States is doing is illegal under international law. You are not allowed to unilaterally impose this punishment. But the U.S. goes even beyond that and imposes what we call secondary sanctions. So say the U.S. imposes sanctions on Iran, well, then other countries are wary about doing business with Iran because the U.S. may say, well, we're going to slap sanctions on you because you did business with a sanctioned country. So that is also illegal, but it is driving, the force for things like BRICS, things like in the Latin America, where they've created alternative banking structures to finance their development so that they don't have to use U.S.-dominated structures like the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank. It's driving other countries to trade in their own currencies or other currencies beside the U.S. dollar. It's driving other countries to create alternative banking institutions so they can trade outside of the U.S. dollar. And so this is harmful to the U.S. I mean, right now we're seeing a sell-off of U.S. assets around the world. Countries are dumping the dollar and they're trading in other currencies. BRICS is facilitating that, but other countries are doing country-to-country trade. And that's all going to harm the United States economically. And this is all for a tactic that isn't even working for the most part. You see countries are developing ways to become self-sufficient. The thought of the United States is, oh, if we cause economic hardship in these countries and we blame it on the governments, those stupid populations are going to be like, oh, we need a new government. But what it is you find that these other countries are completely aware of where the economic hardship is coming from. And even if they have disagreements with their government, they rally behind it because they know they have to beat the United States. So it's not effective at whatever the US's aims are. It's just causing people to isolate us and to work out other systems.
Yeah, and it's not like we, the people, people in the U.S. get money off of the sanctions. It's not like that's an income for us. It's just causing pain and suffering, and it doesn't even do anything for the U.S. economy, even if we're just talking about billionaires. I mean, the sanctions do not bring in money; they just cause destruction. And
Can I just add one thing to that? Because not only do they cause destruction, they harm people in the United States as well. Because look at a country like Cuba that has had incredible medical breakthroughs. Because we have an economic blockade on Cuba, we in the United States cannot benefit from that. It's the same thing. I mean, look at technology in China, so much that we could be, if the United States was a cooperative member of the global economy, we would be doing all sorts of collaboration with other countries that would benefit the population, but instead we shut that down.
And I mean, do you see any? I know that you mentioned the kind of workarounds, but do you see any way for other world economies to pressure the U.S. into backing off? Because I don't see the U.S. waking up one day and being like, you know what, sanctions are a terrible idea. So, do you see any way to leverage political and economic power in other places in the world outside of just the workarounds, but to actually confront U.S. power and say, stop, you have to stop this?
I mean, I think we're starting to see that happening as the world is really shifting to a multipolar world and the U.S. hegemony is declining. You see the United States being invited to fewer and fewer types of collaborations and, being excluded from them, really. I think at some point the U.S. is going to be held accountable for the destruction that we've caused in the world. But right now, we're seeing countries that are kicking out, trying to kick out the U.S. bases. We see the BRICS now has a greater total GDP than the G7. So their economic power is even greater than, what we thought of before as the top economies in the world. And in terms of accountability, I mean, other countries basically, they could kick the U.S. out. They could restrict U.S. Imports. They could, not export to the United States. There are economic measures that other countries could take against the United States, and I think that's starting to build. I mean, we're beginning to see more collaboration by other countries in other ways. So, like, I think of things that give me hope: the United Nations, Friends of the UN Charter, which is a number of countries that have come together to say we need to actually enforce the UN Charter. Because when I read the United Nations Charter a number of years ago, one of the things that doesn't get talked about very much is how the United States on the UN Security Council is always vetoing things. Well, under the Charter, a country that's party to a decision isn't allowed to vote on it. They have to recuse themselves. So imagine if the UN actually prevented the U.S. from, vetoing the things that the majority of the world is in favor of. So that's one thing. I think this new Friends of the Hague group, where countries have come together at the government level to work together. This is the Hague group, to hold Israel accountable, impose, measures on Israel. So we're starting to see the countries working together to stand up to this U.S. hegemony.
Well, and with that, I mean, you mentioned Israel, and I want to make that because you already made the distinction between what the sanctions that the U.S. does, or they're not sanctions, as you pointed out, economic measures, and actual sanctions that would go through the UN vis-a-vis Israel. So the U.S. will never, I mean, as it looks now, the U.S. will never actually vote to leverage legitimate UN sanctions against Israel. What are steps that the UN could take? Maybe that's, pushing the US out of the way in terms of this, but what are steps that other nations can take then to impose legitimate sanctions, not unilateral ones, but legitimate sanctions against Israel when we know that the US would not be party to that?
Right. Right. So I think when it comes to Israel, the UN has taken an important step. The International Court of Justice last summer in July of 2024 issued an advisory opinion on Israel that was questions that were sent to it from the UN General Assembly, which is the way that the world works around the UN Security Council, is that the General Assembly will ask these questions or pass these measures. So the court decided or determined that the state of Israel is an illegal occupation, that it needs to be dismantled, that it needs to return the land to Palestinians, and it needs to pay reparations to Palestinians. Now, the ICJ does not have an enforcement mechanism, but what that opinion does is it gives countries then the power to say, we're going to take action based on these determinations. And so countries can restrict their trade with Israel. They can restrict travel. I can't remember which country I just read about today that's blocking Ben Gvir from being able, I think, to travel there. So, countries can take those kinds of actions. Stop sending weapons, stop sending the supplies. We're starting to see, more and more of that beginning to happen. And I think that's what's coming out of the Hague group is we're seeing, countries like Colombia that says we won't sell coal to Israel anymore. And those are things that countries can do unilaterally. That those are their individual decisions.
And I mean, but do you think that it would have the power to, I mean, I guess the question is, do you think that UN sanctions would then have the power to stop the genocide? And if so, do you think these unilateral decisions would have the power to stop the genocide and or beyond that actually go towards what that advisory opinion states?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it? Because we don't have this enforcement mechanism. And because the United States, although the power is dwindling, continues seemingly to hold a significant amount of power over other countries. That's the hope. I think the reality is at this point, because we don't have multilateral institutions that are functional in the United States, we're seeing a growing calling for that. It's interesting. When I talk to human rights lawyers from around the world, they're all saying we need new structures. And that's part of what the Hague Group is talking about as well. We need new anti-imperialist multilateral structures that we can use to enforce international law. It's not that difficult. The United States has been violating international law, not just with the sanctions, but with our violations of the treaties that we're party of as well, like the Convention on Genocide. The United States has an obligation to take concrete action to prevent genocide. And instead, we're sending billions of dollars to Israel and weapons to Israel and personnel to Israel. And, now we've set up this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. That's a mechanism to draw people in, starve them, say, here, come get some food, and what will kill you on the way. I mean, it's beyond the pale what the United States is getting away with in supporting this genocide.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanna ask, because you've worked so much on this, not just through Sanctions Kill, but also through your work with Popular Resistance, is really how to have these conversations. And because I think, especially right now with what's happening with Israel, the conversation is sanctions good, right? And sanctions would be good. What a nice idea. And so when somebody reads this Lancet piece, it's difficult to wrap our heads around the differences that we've just discussed here, but also this idea of death being something that is so removed from us, even though we're seeing pictures from Gaza, but it feels just so removed. It's like on a different planet. And in reality, I'm in Sweden right now. It's just a little south of me. It's right there. It's not a different world. How to have these conversations that not just fill people with the reality, which could also lead to nihilism and despair, but to feel people with this feeling of being engaged. Like, okay, I do have leverage. I do have the ability to engage myself in these fights, and there is a point, and it's not just this far away thing. What are some ways that you feel like we can talk about that?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, is that we do need to be educating people more in the United States, because there is really, the media is not providing the information that people need, that we're not having the debates that we need to be having, that, the United States recognized that people are not happy about us sending bombs or bombing other countries or sending our military members out to get killed. So, we found this great way that we can cause the same amount of destruction, but we can sell it to our population as humane war, as if there's such a thing as a humanitarian war. So just having that conversation about, are you aware of how the U.S. uses economic measures in violation of international law to punish the populations of other countries? I think what's important that came out of this study is, just as you mentioned Iraq and Madeleine Albright, the study found that overwhelmingly the highest number of deaths, I think it was 51% of the deaths, are in children ages 5 and younger. And then there's another high proportion in people who are 60 years and older. So it's the most vulnerable people in a population who are being impacted by this. And actually at Sanctions Kill, I created a toolkit that people can use to have that conversation. It's very easy to use. It has a script, it has slides. It teaches people in easy to understand terms what sanctions are and what they do and how they specifically work in various sectors like food and health and energy and public safety like water and things like that. So I think people could use those to have those conversations in their communities. In terms of actions, I mean, a lot of the sanctions come through executive orders and through the Treasury, where the executive office says, we think this country's a national security threat, then that clears the way for OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control in the Treasury Department, to issue sanctions. But it also comes through Congress. And there are, various laws that have passed through Congress pushing sanctions on other countries. So that's a place where we do have a voice in terms of educating our Congress members and showing our opposition to these types of measures in our communities. People got to get outside of the U.S. media to read what's really going on in other countries, because so much is done here to manufacture consent for these economic wars, to demonize countries like Nicaragua. I remember I traveled to Nicaragua last summer, and I had interviewed a former State Department official who had quit over what was happening in Gaza. And he was like, "Oh, you're going to Nicaragua? That's so dangerous." And I'm thinking, even within the State Department, he's fallen for this problem. I mean, like, Nicaragua is one of the safest countries that you can go to. But it's on the U.S. target list, so they demonize it. It's a common tactic. So people have to see through that if they want to understand, what's really going on and what the U.S. is doing.
Yeah, and as you pointed out earlier, how that connects to our everyday struggles. I think, one of the hardest things that I've found is getting, people engaged in these anti-war, anti-foreign policy issues when they're like, but what does that have to do with the price of bread? And I'm like, well, let me explain. Like all of these things are connected. And
Right.
as you pointed out, like these things are done through executive order, which then is also connected to, wait, I thought we had a democracy or a republic or whatever. And I didn't vote for this. I didn't vote for this to be something that has my name on it. So I think it really, that just really highlights all of these interconnected issues. And I would recommend that folks check out the Sanctions Kill campaign that, as you pointed out, Margaret, there's a lot of great information there and a lot of great toolkits. Also, check out popularresistance.org. There's so much important alternative media there. And it just gives a really powerful and important and honestly a missing viewpoint that you'll never find in corporate media. That's at popularresistance.org. Margaret, thanks so much for taking the time to come onto the show and make these distinctions for us.
Thank you, Eleanor.